Good morning, and welcome to the Bible worship time at the Camelback Church of Christ. We resume the studies in the book of Mark. Our regular instructor for the day, Jim Hoggett, is not able to be here today. My name is Ron Butler, and glad that you will be joining us. We pick up in the book of Mark. We're going to start in Mark 12, a familiar verse for many of us. Starting in 30 and 31, the greatest commandment, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandments are greater than these. I can't think of a more appropriate time for us to focus on this message in Mark, that the greatest commandment, love God. Second greatest commandment, therefore, is love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these. So these may be some of the hardest times we are going through for us to fully absorb how we should be loving our neighbor. Well, don't feel alone if you have some neighbors that are maybe unlovable. There many of us are. Maybe they're not what you would call good neighbors. They don't respect the quiet. Maybe there's a party going on. Maybe they don't respect your privacy. Perhaps there's just nothing you have in common with your neighbor. But that doesn't change the commandment. It still stands. We're to love our neighbor. In a few minutes, we'll go into some details of how the early Christians, in circumstances worse than these, really executed properly on what the meaning of the good neighbor should be. They did it simply by being neighborly. You can look that up in the dictionary. When I was in school, there was one dictionary. It was the Webster's Dictionary. And now you can find all kinds. The one I found was a modern dictionary that just says neighborly is the act of being a good neighbor. Well, didn't that help clear everything up? Fortunately, we have the Bible to go into and look at the many, many verses it has, including the Old Testament and the New Testament, where my count is over 100 times it's called out to be a good neighbor. Equally with that number is I found over 100 times that the Bible talks about a pandemic, what we call today a pandemic. Maybe it was called a plague or something else at that time. Now, it's just not the Old Testament that talks about plagues. When you look at it in Moses' time in Egypt, yeah, there were those 10 plagues. They became famous. We knew them well. And they really referred to probably something called a pestilence. And we know about the 7 bowls that were the 7 plagues that we talk about in the book of Revelation. But in between, there's probably 90 more instances of pandemics and plagues. And we will look at those. In fact, the Bible uses prominently 5 words to describe pestilence and plagues and pandemics and epidemics. First one is a word Hebrew, and I try not to slaughter this pronunciation too bad, daber, D-A-B-E-R, and that refers to a pestilence, the things that you saw in the plagues of Egypt. And the second is Makkah, M-A-K-K-A-H, and Amos used that singularly to talk about something that was not the same thing, but he said, in the manner of the plagues of Egypt. Then there's the word nega, N-E-G-A, like negative. That is a pestilence or plague or pandemic that was instituted directly by God. And boy, did I find that hard to take. But when you review the Bible, that happened. I was hoping that every time I would find the word plague or pestilence or something like that, it would be Satan had caused it. But God used it as a weapon, sometimes as punishment. And we can talk about some of those later. And finally, in the New Testament, especially in the book of Luke, there are 2 words that are used, loismos, L-O-I-S-M-O-S, and plage, P-L-A-G-E, which obviously is pretty close to plague. But those were slightly different in terms of what was the intent of what was going on. Let's go back in history for a moment. Now then, we're going to talk about what we started out with. The early Christians were faced with pandemics and plagues, and they knew exactly what they needed to do. I was reading some excerpts from an interesting book. A historian, Rodney Stark, wrote a book not too long ago, The Triumph of Christianity, How the Jesus Movement Became the World's Largest Religion. Very interesting. He takes us back through some history in the days of the Roman Empire. So in the year about 165, a pandemic like no other struck the land. Throughout the Roman Empire, it lasted 15 years. 15 years in which a third of the population of the settled world at that time, all the way up in the United Kingdom, most of Europe, part of Eastern Europe, the Mediterranean, as far as the Middle East, that population was decimated. Here's what was happening. In Rome, throughout the empire too, Christians were still thriving, although they'd been persecuted early on. What happened when the pandemic struck here was that there was a difference between how the pagan population and the Roman government handled it and how the Christians handled it. The practice at that time, because even then it was known that these plagues were spread by contact, being in close quarters. So the pagan population, and while the Roman government ignored it for the most part, immediately moved people, servants, or loved ones out of their house and into the streets and let them just die. The difference was the early Christians did some simple things that we now call neighborly. And just like the scriptures we've been studying today, how to be a good neighbor, simple things. To those afflicted, not only in their household, but their neighbors, they offered water. Medically, you have to stay hydrated, right? Today, they made sure that happened because people were unable to go draw their own water. Second thing they did is they provided nourishment. You have to keep the strength up somehow. So everybody that was their neighbor, apparently what they were doing according to the historical records was making sure those who could not feed themselves were fed. And then they practiced just good sanitation habits. I don't know if they used masks, but what they did do was make sure that they stayed physically clean, their household stayed clean, and their neighbors were cleaned as well. So where would the early Christians know that? This is just the 2nd century after the persecution, the death, the resurrection of Jesus. How did they know it? Well, they had access to the scriptures. They could look into Leviticus and see that in times of plague, pestilence, or disease, wherever the God had been and had left his imprint on the people of Israel, there were records left for them on here's what one must do. Sometimes it involved isolation. We hear that all the time now in our society. We call it the stay-at-home order. The don't get out. The don't violate social distancing. At that time, they simply practiced good person-to-person skills of not making a lot of contact outside their villages and their camps. Even when somebody was sent outside the tents, they were not sent to fend for themselves. They were just put in another tent until they could have an opportunity to get over what was happening. They had the background. They had the commandments. Mostly they had the love. They had the good examples of Jesus on how to take care of this. So that was in about 165. That wasn't the end of it. It lasted 15 years, and many millions died. If it was a third of the population, if that happened today in the United States of America, we would have 50 million people already dead. Here we are anxious a few months into it to have it over. We mourn the loss of anybody, friend, family, or just somebody that we read about who has died from this pandemic. We've already received one of God's blessings. That is, that it's not of the scale that it was at that time. We go forward into the next century in the Roman Empire, and here's what happened again. Another pandemic. What had been learned? Well, what had been learned was that the Christians began to grow after this. Their ratio of their percentage of the population grew. They simply didn't have the deaths at the time of the first pandemic. There were more of them to care for more people. The next pandemic, and I'll give credit to it, the historian probably hints at this a bit, that because of the nursing skills, elementary as they were, of the Christian population, people lived. That pandemic they got through. The empire had a population that was not devastated like before, but here's an interesting thing that happened. We go into the 300s, and it had been so noticed about the neighborliness, the grace of the Christians, that Rome got its first Christian empire, Constantine. I think he ruled for about 30 years. And during this time, he took some examples of Christian charity and expanded it to the rest of the empire. Rudimentary hospitals, nursing care facilities, clean water, civil engineering to take care of taking the waste products out of a city. All of those became priorities as he expanded. Aqueducts, things like that. When he passed away, there was a successor emperor. That emperor was a pagan. He wanted to bring back universality. If you saw a God you wanted to worship that God. He wanted for people to have the freedom to go and do what they wanted to do as their spirits guided them. And he tried to implement back into the Roman Empire a practice that it was a pagan society. But the lessons had been learned, and the population made this determination, in my words from having read this. They wanted to be more like Christians in their charity and their neighborliness than they did their pagan neighbors. And so the Christian religion began to continue to grow, face some more oppression, but continue to grow. Well, after these pandemics, after these things, Christianity's got a good start. What do we learn from this? I think we learn that there's a difference between what's been popular to look at a situation and say, what would Jesus do? But now that we know some more background and we have all these verses available to us in the Bible to look at what did Christians do. It's a bit like James. In the book of James, there's a distinction made between your faith and your works. And James makes the point that the two are not incompatible. You have to have faith and works. So the early Christians exhibited what we'll call Christian mercy from the teachings that they had about sanitation through Leviticus and other books in the Bible, but also because they took exactly to heart what the definition was, love thy neighbor. Let's look at some examples of what goes on today. We have some options. What are our expectations? One, I think we're already blessed despite, again, the sensitivity we must have for people who are still dying. But it's not 100 million people in the United States. We're being blessed. Some of this has to do that we need to think of the first thing is that God gave us a brain. He gave us common sense. He gave us the Bible to look at. He gave us the examples in the Bible of people that we should strive to be. He gave us a brain to think about these things. So we know from what we read in the Bible, what we've been taught, that being a Christian has some cautiousness about it. We don't run headlong into every fire that comes along. But it's not a weakness of ours that puts us on the sidelines and says we can't be a part of that. The examples are too strong to the contrary for that. We talk about mortality. Some of us will die, no doubt about it. We're all God's creations. We are all people. We are all human. We are created in God's image. Let's talk about that a little bit. In Genesis, the first chapter, in verse 19, God created us in His image. He didn't make us all look like Him or look like Jesus. He didn't make us all male, if we obviously know that. But He created us in the image, and the word in the scriptures is more like this. He created us to think more like Him and do what He would do than to be personally centric, to be what we want to be, and to go through life like that. I think that's in Genesis 1:27, starting about 1:19. You can read about all the creation there and see that God wants us to be in the image of Him and that is a kind person. A kind person who uses what we have, doesn't make ourselves the center front of everything. Another thing we can take away from this is Christians suffer like non-Christians. That's the way that we are alike. None of us is superior. None of us are better than. Some of us have different economic situations. Some of us have had better things happen to us in life. But God created us all with the knowledge that we are mortal. I've said this before, and let's think about it carefully. The goal of a Christian is not to die and go to heaven. It's not to die and go to heaven. That's not our goal. That's our reward. That's God's plan for us. The goal of the Christian is to live every day that God gives us in a way that pleases God, removes the barriers, and helps us get closer to Him so that we can experience the fullness of being a Christian. And it's only reasonable that we start with the greatest commandments. We've got to love God. We'll read some scriptures in a moment. You can't love God and hate your neighbor. In 2 Timothy 17, for the Spirit of God gives us, does not make us timid. For the Spirit that God gave us does not make us timid, but gives us power to love and to experience self-discipline. In the Psalms, David is, I think, the psalmist of this one. I think it's in Psalm 120. The Lord will watch over your comings and your goings now and forever. It's not a promise of immortality. It's not a promise that we're bulletproof, that we're immune to everything. But in all things, God is looking over us. Does God solve everything for us? No, He leaves some things to our own devices. He leaves some things to, these are the consequences of things that we experience in a fallen world. I look at the words of John in chapter 13 and verse 13. By this I know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Wow, Jesus just laid this out there for us. In John 13:13, Jesus looks into our souls. He looks into our character. He looks into who we are. And He says, I can tell that you are a disciple if you do what? If you have love for one another. We're not in the time of complete peace, and we're not in the time of the final redemption. We're in the times as they are. We've been equipped. We've been given the instruction. A lot of it falls on us, how we deal with ourselves and our fellow man. Not just to please ourselves, not just to make ourselves more comfortable in life, but because Jesus is there and He's watching. God's watching over us. And Jesus is there to evaluate whether we're His disciples or not. Let's look at another verse. We'll go over to the book in Matthew 22, verses 37 through 40. Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is love your neighbor as yourself. All the law of the prophets hang on these two commandments. It just goes a step further than Mark said in the same thing. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So what does that mean? Notice that there's a sequence. It's important for all scriptures we know to read it as it is. Here's what it says. The sequence is, before you can love your neighbor, you must love God first. And they're connected. If you don't love your neighbor, how can you love God? Because He said these are the commandments that are important. Let's go over to Ephesians. Ephesians 3, I'll be in chapter 4, verse 25. I'll start there. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 25. Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor, If there was a period right there, that'd pretty much be the sum of what we're talking about. For we are all members of one body. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only that which is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. Let's face it, there's a lot of noise out there today. There is a lot of things that we weren't exposed to a few years ago. Social media, news 24/7, things that pass for the news 24/7, commentary, blogs. So much out there. It's not just what we see in the newspapers from way back. It's there. It's out there in front of us all the time. I think God anticipated that. He had the writer right there for us. Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor. I don't know that that means for me to go next door and tell my neighbor, I'm tired of your music, that's the truth. But it does tell me that I can't make up stories about my neighbor. It does tell me that when I speak to that person, I need to speak to them from truth, not from opinion, not from what I believe, and not from what I just read. In 1 Corinthians, the 10th chapter and the 24th verse, 1 Corinthians 10:24. No one should seek their own good, but the good of others. Wait a minute. No one should seek their own good, but the good of others? I thought we were a race of people who were supposed to be constantly improving ourselves, to make sure that we look out for how do we get ahead. Well, that's immersion into culture. That's not what God is looking for. If we go into anything with a motive to how do we come out of this the best we can do, we're only halfway there. God's looking for us, as it says in 1 Corinthians, to look out for the good of others. So we have a responsibility. Where did that responsibility start? You can trace it all the way back to the creation. When they came to the point in the creation when God said that there should be living beings, and He created man, He created woman, and then He created the bond, the responsibility that Adam had over all the animals. He asked Adam to name them, sort of personalized it that way. And you know, things were going along fine. Sin enters the world. And what's the first casualty of that? Well, we can say it was Adam and Eve. They had to work the ground forever and contend with thistles and thorns. Life was not going to be good. But the first casualty was God killed one of His own creations, an animal, in order to give them, Adam and Eve, clothing. They weren't looking out for anything but their own good. And the consequence, it was not good for the rest of mankind and God's creations. 1 Thessalonians 5:11. 1 Thessalonians 5:11. Good advice for being neighborly right here. Therefore, encourage one another and build each other up, just as in fact you are doing. Somebody was doing this right. I guess it was the Thessalonians. Encourage one another and build each other up. That's a lesson that can come home to us very pointedly. We can't tear people down to make ourselves feel better. We can't give somebody a peace of mind because that's what's on our mind. If it doesn't help build somebody up, then we are not doing what God would have us to do. There's a word that's used in the Bible. It's called an exhortation. Exhortation. I think it's a complex concept. What it simply tries to say is that exhort, move people along. But it doesn't say be preachy about it. It doesn't say be superior about it. It doesn't say be condescending about it. What it says, exhort, to encourage, as it says here in 1 Thessalonians. This verse stood out to me when I was doing this lesson. Proverbs 14:21, real short, simple verse. Whoever despises his neighbor is a sinner, but blessed he is who is generous to the poor. He who is generous to the poor. How do we express that generosity? Oh, we have a pantry program here. That's great. People work hard at it to make sure that anybody who needs it has access to it. who's poor now? Well, you could look at statistics in this country, and they divide it into the poverty level above and below the poverty level. What we've just been through with, was it over 40 million people out of jobs at one time? A lot of people are more poor than they were. There's been no greater time in our living in this country, in our lifetimes, to recognize that every chance we get, try to encourage somebody, because there are some discouraged people in the world right now, very discouraged. I'm going to leave the lesson with you with this. In 1 John chapter 4, verses 20 and 21. Whoever claims to love God and yet hates a brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother and sister, whom they have seen, cannot love God, whom they have not seen. And he has given us this command: anyone who loves God must also love their brother and sister. When Jesus was asked, who's my brother and sister and who's my mother, he had answers for that. In Matthew 7, I think it's famous for, the world calls it the golden rule. So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law of the prophets. Remember, we just read that this commandment was so that we would understand the law and the prophets. And there's a difference between the law, the Mosaic law, of course, things that were do this, don't do that. Then there's the 10 Commandments, the law. And then finally there's the commandments that we got because Jesus came and wanted to make things right between us and God. And he put it out there pretty plainly. And you can go through the Bible and find more and more of these. God's command in John 15 is love each other as I've loved you. Love each other as I've loved you. Doesn't that sound like God is saying, pass it on? Here it is, it's yours. I love you. Here it is, I love you. I love you. What do you do with it? Keep it bottled up? No, we pass it along. As we get through this pandemic, we'll be changed. But in all things, the laws remain eternal that God gives us. And that is that the way we get to heaven is not account on how we're going to do or manage ourselves. It's on account of how we respect one another as our neighbors, as we love God. Thank you. Our time is over. We'll begin the worship service here in a few minutes. Thank you for tuning in today, and thank you for being here today.